start the discussion. So welcome to the September meeting of the Jacksonville Linux Users Group. I'm your secretary, Michael Marbut. I'm joined by my co-host, Dan Beitelman.
Hey guys.
Dan.
Hey, how's it going?
So today I wanted to talk a little bit about, we just had a nice little chit-chat warm-up pre-show, and but today I wanted to talk a little bit about Microsoft. And
I gotta replace my battery in my headset real quick.
Sure.
Sorry,
So I
but go ahead.
wanted to talk about Microsoft, and I imagined that this meeting was going to be in person, and I came up with this idea, I don't know, 6 months ago, and I wanted to have everyone in the Linux users group just shaking their fists at me and like, yeah, you can't talk about Microsoft at a Linux users group. And I'm not here to tell anybody in the Linux users group that I want you to switch to Windows. But the overall idea was that I wanted to talk a little bit about some changes that have happened recently at Microsoft that have become a little bit more Linux friendly and have started to kind of open up some of the Microsoft products and started to make some changes with Linux in mind. So that was the overall idea here. So one of the first things that I noticed that was a big change in the way that Microsoft was doing things came almost 2 years ago when I noticed that SSH was coming to PowerShell and Windows operating system. So Windows introduced as a like a beta feature, as a pre-release feature, the ability to run an SSH server and SSH into servers native on Windows. And so they implemented OpenSSH, and for a while it was a beta preview option, and you would have to go into, it was Windows features and settings, and you had to turn on the OpenSSH feature and setting. And then, now that it has fully updated, OpenSSH is installed by default on all the new Windows 10 machines. So if you didn't already know, right now you can open up a PowerShell window on your Windows machine and you can OpenSSH into servers and such. So that was the first thing. And so as a simple little demonstration, I'm sure I've got some things around here. We can go open. Oh, this is my WSL. So here I am. This is a PowerShell window here, and I can open, or I can SSH into pi at 92.168.1.145, and yes, and my super secret password here. And here we are SSH'd into my Octoprint server here on my own network, straight through PowerShell and not having to mess with anything else, just straight through Linux. And that's a very different mindset than it used to be, because you used to have to use RDP to access any Windows servers, or you would have to use a VM in order to SSH into a server. So that's a kind of cool thing that Microsoft has done to change in the last few years around Linux and being able to SSH. The setup nowadays is very, very simple. All it does is it's built in by default. They also have what they call a new PS session, or PS sessions, which is PowerShell's version of SSH. But you don't even really have to use that. You can use it as the OpenSSH implementation. So then the next interesting thing that has come out in the last couple years is the calculator that has been installed in Windows computers since 1990 recently became open source. I believe this has been in the last year. They open sourced the calculator that they have been sending on Windows computers for 30 years now. And so this is the GitHub repository for the Microsoft calculator, and they've got it all posted up out on the internet now. So that's a kind of interesting, cool change to the philosophy of former Linux our former Windows philosophy has all been everything's closed source and secret and compiled, and you don't get a peek at it.
a question from IRC: is the SSH client installed on Windows as well?
The Windows SSH client is installed by default, and the SSH server you can enable. Does that answer the question?
Yes, that answers the question.
Okay. So yes, by default the SSH is installed. So something that I didn't really have a very good slide for that I also found kind of interesting about a shift at Microsoft is that they actually bought GitHub. And so GitHub is now owned and operated by Microsoft, which I haven't seen any downside to that. So I know a lot of people were really worried when Microsoft bought GitHub, but I haven't seen any ups or downs since they bought GitHub. Maybe somebody else has an opinion about the changes in GitHub, but so far they're now GitHub is still available for free and is a primary source of people sharing and collaborating on open source code.
I wonder why they bought GitHub.
I have one of the other ones. They said that this is about them. Satya Nadella said that he wanted to move towards open source adoption and grow the business through generating revenues. Cloud, open source some of its code, and acquired GitHub. But it didn't really say specifically, but it sounds like it's just a shift in focus. Acquisition led to a few new projects to migrate away from GitHub.
Yeah, maybe they wanted to make sure that GitHub was stable so that they could put all their stuff out there, so they just bought it.
For sure, maybe. Yeah, and then you see that their repository is posted. And that one of the other cool things that I noticed is a lot of the Microsoft documentation is also being hosted on GitHub. So you can submit pull requests to update Microsoft documentation now as well. So, moving on from there, I think it's been 5 years now, they Microsoft released Windows Subsystem for Linux. And I remember I showed up to my first Linux users group meeting with a Windows computer and Windows Subsystem for Linux, which everybody thought that I was pretty goofy, but I thought that I was being pretty cool. But Windows Subsystem for Linux came out, and they now have probably 10 or 15 different distributions. And the Windows Subsystem for Linux was a kernel with an API that you would connect into that. It wasn't the full kernel. It was an API that you would send commands back and forth to bash. And it didn't have access to any of the hardware of the computer. It didn't have access to a lot of the file permissions on the file system. And it was kind of limited and sandboxed into kind of like a little hole. And that was the original Windows Subsystem for Linux. And the way that you can get the Windows Subsystem for Linux on some of the older machines is that you go in here and you run this enable feature command, and it will, this is for the second version. I don't think they even have the original install for Windows Subsystem for Linux, but it's one command. It says enable optional feature Windows Subsystem for Linux, and it will install. And then you can choose which distro you want to add into Windows Subsystem for Linux from the Microsoft Store. And so I have been waiting for this speech for the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2 to come out of Insider Preview into the full version. And now the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2 has a full Linux kernel installed inside of Windows and has full hardware support, and it's a full VM kernel that's running inside of Windows. So you can see that they've got their performance chart here. And having used Windows Subsystem for Linux 1 for a long time, and now I'm using Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, it is much faster, much smoother, and it can do some cool things that the first one couldn't do. For instance, running an Nmap scan was one of the things that, because it couldn't access the network adapter on the physical hardware of the computer, you couldn't use Nmap at all. It didn't have enough permissions to be able to run that. So I believe faster performance, architecture, the full kernel is built in here. Latest stable branch, available at kernel.org. Specifically tuned for WSL2. Latest security and kernel improvements. And here's their blog post on that. Increase performance. This picture they had. Here it is. Is this it? No. They had an example in here of the two side by side running when they were kind of trying to pump up the WSL 2 type stuff. They had a side by side kind of video little GIF thing that showed both of them running the same commands, and WSL is quite obviously much faster. But I don't see that little sneak preview type thing anymore. So WSL 2 is now out in release. It runs much faster. And let me, if I remember correctly, I will go to here. And so in order, if you have WSL1 installed, all you have to do is WSL1, and it is version, and it will tell you set version, and it will tell you set version Ubuntu 2004 1. I already have mine set for number 2 in this, but all you have to do is run this command here, and it will set whatever distro you have in this command here to WSL2 as the version. And I believe I can list distributions with this command. Distributions. Oh, I can't spell apparently. Distribution. Still can't spell. Or TAC-D would be much easier. And then I probably need the list, I think. TAC the list is the command I'm looking for. So here's my my Windows subsystem for Linux that I have available, and then I can set, probably want to set default to Ubuntu 20.04, and then I want to set the version of the other one. So you can change lots of things about WSL before you get into them, and then once you launch them, you can start to affect things inside of them. So I can set set default.
Just like a container.
Option, yeah. Or set default version. I can set the default user that I'm going to log in as. So I had a problem with that I had to set myself up to log in as root in order to give my regular user account enough permissions to, in the sudoers list and everything else. Because by default I was setting up as root, so I had to go in as root, set up the account, and then set the default account to be the other account.
Is there a Gentoo distribution on there?
Let's take a look. That is its own tab on here. So we have right here. I have a list of some of the different ones on the Windows Store.
I forgot. It's like it's delayed, so I'm like, I don't see anything. What are you talking about?
What are
Oh
you
yeah,
talking
there's
about? So we have Ubuntu, Kali, Debian, Fedora. Is Alpine and Raft look like they're on here? OpenSUSE,
Alpine is very
CentOS.
popular in Docker.
Yeah.
It's a very lightweight Linux.
Yep. And then CentOS 8 and 7. And a couple other ones that I don't recognize that may or may not actually be. There's
You
some
have
there's
to
some kind of
buy CentOS?
no. There's some off-brand weird things in
What
here.
is that?
Are there any free CentOS?
That
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if that's okay for them
You,
to do.
you know what? I researched this one time. Actually, somebody in one of my Raspberry Pi groups on Facebook was asking about CentOS and if they should buy it, and I really was a little bit up in arms about somebody selling CentOS like that. But it is
Yeah.
actually CentOS that's selling this. So if you drill into
Red Hat,
here,
really?
no, not this one. But I drilled into one of these that was like on the Microsoft Store here, and I
Hmm.
drilled down into it, and sure enough, it was the actual foundation. Like, if you went to the URL that they supplied on here, I found that it was the same company. So maybe CentOS regular.
That doesn't seem like it's a thing on
It
that
it
one
really doesn't.
particularly.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe these
So
are just some
what
hacky
what is the
Chinese things.
quality assurance that we have that this is not like just a totally jacked version of Linux? Like, is
Yeah.
there a link to the source, or like
Yeah. Not much.
is there like a show on who's the developer? Can you report
No.
this?
Yes. You. Yeah.
Can
You should.
can anybody just like upload a version of Linux and be like,
Yeah.
hey, it's $4?
I don't know what kind of quality control they've got on the store here, so that's kind of hacky. I don't like some of these other weird
Yeah,
ones down here, but I
like I
know,
mean, it looks like the Ubuntu and the Kali and like
yeah,
those ones seem to be fairly well
those
maintained, but
those are official.
there seems to be some sketch running around there too.
Yeah,
So if
used
somebody's
with caution,
new to
everyone.
this, like specifically if somebody's new to this type of thing, you should not be paying for Linux.
Yes,
You can pay. There's nothing wrong with like
donating.
you can donate. You can like you can buy versions like Red Hat Linux. CentOS is Red Hat Linux, but it's Red Hat Linux you don't have to pay for. And you can download all of the Red Hat Linux source and compile Red Hat Linux for yourself. But if you want a binary of it, you have to pay them.
Hmm.
That's the difference. And you also pay for support. Um, but Linux has to be free, or at least a lot. Anything that's released under the GPL has to be source code
Yep.
available.
Yep.
You don't have like they don't have to compile it and hand it to you and be like, here you go, it's free. They can be like, you have to pay for this, but if you ask for the source code, they have to provide you. Well, they have to openly provide it. You don't have
Hmm.
to ask for it; it's just there.
Yep.
So
Yep. Under the license that it's for. So yeah, these CentOS ones might be really sketchy and hacky. So we'll have to see.
yeah, might need to report those or
Yeah,
something.
something. But yeah, I just searched for WSL here in the Microsoft Store, and this is kind of the top ones that I got here. So I'll have to go look at what these are and who actually
Yeah,
put these up
and
there.
and so I see
That's sketchy.
on the stream right now, it's probably gone now, but yeah, Ubuntu. It
Hmm.
said it was from Canonical, and
Hmm.
Canonical's the people that make Ubuntu.
Hmm. So
So
I don't see Gentoo inside of WSL for Linux, but I
yeah,
see some of the other popular ones here available. So
yeah.
um, so moving on, I'm gonna go in here, set default version. Set Ubuntu-1804. I still have set to WSL1, so I'm going to set the version to number 2 and see if I can update it really quick. It doesn't like that. It takes I don't know, about 5 minutes to update from WSL1 to WSL2. So it
Would you
just
mind throwing up a Resmon or something and see what your machine's doing for having to take that long, or if it's like a lot of I/O, or if it's a lot of CPU, or
yeah, we could do that.
something to discuss for 5 minutes while we're waiting on it?
I was gonna flip to another tab.
Oh,
And come back to it.
okay. Well, never mind. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. So I'll do. Why doesn't it like my options? Distro user export import. Set default version. Set version, that's what it is. Set version. And then the distro that you want to change, and then the version that you want to set it to. Still doesn't like that. And this one might just be called Ubuntu. Okay. Well, I already upgraded the first one, so that was kind of oh, that's my problem. I don't have 2 techs. You guys can watch me flounder in PowerShell for 20 minutes. 18.
That's the Windows tax. You have to use PowerShell.
There goes the right one. 2 dashes on set version. Thank you. He found it at the exact same time I did, except for the stream's like 5 minutes delayed, or like 30 seconds delayed. So took me 30 seconds longer than he did. So here we go. This is the conversion. Conversion is in process. It may take a few minutes, but I've already done my Ubuntu 2004, and so here I am inside of Bash, actually. So I can cd home, and I've got, I can, just run my Linux commands here. Desktop.
And people might hear me and think I'm being hard on PowerShell. I mean, I like Bash a lot, but PowerShell is night and day better than Command. Like it's so nice for the Windows admins. I felt so bad for them for so long.
Oh god, it's terrible. And so I was doing Active Directory management, and yeah, you can't do that with the old command options. And I learned PowerShell just to do Active Directory commands and scripting. So, and it's full Linux type thing. So the other thing that you could not do in WSL1 was something like an Nmap scan. So if I wanted to scan that server that we connected to earlier, .1.145, here on my network, now I can run Nmap against it and pull back, all the things that it's doing, right? So increased performance, increased functionality. It can do things like Nmap. It can get to the different files on the C drive. They're all under mount, /mount, and then it'll be under C, cdc. So here's my C drive on my Windows computer. So a lot better, a lot more. And then one of the other things that I used to notice, and maybe I should have had an extra WSL1 sitting around, C matrix used to choke out WSL1, and it would just cook. So
what's C matrix?
Oh, C matrix. This is a fun little command. It's in the apt repository, and when you run C matrix, I'm sure you'll be seeing it about 10 seconds, Dan. It just runs a matrix type thing on the command line, and so it's got a couple command arguments, but you can have it run as a screensaver or.
Oh yeah, I have seen that a while back. I think we were playing with that at the 2600 meeting one time. We just had it running.
Yeah, so I like to do something like tmux, and then I will run a couple different windows here. And what is up and down? Up and down is like this, maybe? No. But then I'll run like C matrix on one side and htop on the other, and then I'll pull up like something else, and it'll just have lots of different things on it. I'll look like a hacker.
That's cute.
If my kids want to come over and watch.
On WSL1, it would just choke on that, huh?
Yes, so it would actually slow down and freeze up, and you could
Wow.
tell it wasn't moving smoothly. And even in the manual page of C Matrix, he says that it's processor intensive, but it doesn't really register when you look at the thing. But yeah, right at the bottom it says, "Bugs. This program is very CPU intensive. Don't be surprised if it eats up over 40% of your CPU at a time." But
Wow.
WSL1 wouldn't do it. So now that I've upgraded to WSL2, it runs much smoother.
It's actually lagging the stream a little bit.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it stopped lagging. That was funny. No, I was still looking at C Matrix and Gen 2, and apparently there's an X flag. So apparently you can do it on a terminal, but it also has the ability to do it in X, so you can have like a
Nice.
window.
Yes, and that's the other cool thing. Oh, that's weird. X flag does something funky on this one.
Well, you're not running an X server, so
Well, that's the other cool thing about WSL2 is it now will do X. It'll do an X window. So Kali has
well,
built.
WSL2 will actually do
Mm-hmm.
X.
Yeah, it'll actually
How?
do. It has the. You have to have an X server on your Windows computer, but
Oh, so you have to like pipe it through Xming or something.
yes. So,
Okay, so
but
it'll fire up the binaries and stuff, but it'll export the material out to an X server.
out to an X server exactly.
Gotcha.
So,
All right.
so Kali now the Kali build actually has a full VM desktop through WSL2. So when you set up Kali to go through WSL2, you can actually open up the full Windows and everything into the graphic windows. So
What's a good Windows X server nowadays? Because all I remember was like Xming, and I don't know if that's even a thing anymore. That
I
was like
think
15 years
let
ago.
me look at what I've got. The only one that I found, I think, is X. I don't know what I have. I had to find one for when I was doing that cuckoo speech. I had to find one because it's a pain in the butt to manage the virtual machines over SSH. So I had to go through
Mm,
X in order to get into VirtualBox.
right.
But I
I,
don't
I usually
remember what
just
it
fire up a whole
was.
VM in like
Right?
VirtualBox and just use that as my Linux thing. Because like I've played with WSL, but I think I played mostly with WSL1.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there seems to be a distinct lack of a good X server
Yeah, this
for
one,
Windows or Mac, really. I mean,
this
Mac
one.
has like Dolphin or something, but
Oh yeah, this one just came out of Insider Preview about a month ago for WSL2.
what, an X server?
No, the WSL2.
Oh,
It's
okay.
been Insider Preview for a while.
Oh, all right.
I don't know which X server I got, so maybe if somebody knows of a good X server for Windows, I know I found 2 or 3, and Muba Xterm. That's what I chose. Muba
Drop that into
Xterm.
IRC.
Yep. MOBA Xterm.
Cool.
It's going to be like premonition because they haven't seen this part on the stream yet. But this right here, this guy has so it'll do X into the WSL on its own, and then it has SSH, RDP, VNC, and it's kind of like I don't know, it's kind of like Putty, but it's also got an X server inside of it.
I mean, that's a pretty big win to have an X server in there.
Right? So yeah, here's where I was building that Cuckoo server, and I was using X to be able to open up VirtualBox on the Cuckoo server, the graphic user interface, so that I could mess with the VMs inside of the Cuckoo server.
Cool.
So yeah, so this was a neat. Well, this is not a Microsoft shift to Windows, but with WSL for 2. Um, let's see. Go GUI, and then I didn't want this. Oh, it doesn't like that. Why am I in videos? It's a GUI desktop. So here's Bleeping Computers article about the GUI desktop on Windows Subsystem for Linux. So now real kernel run inside of Hyper-V. Using this feature, WinKex spawns a Windows VNC client. So I guess it's through VNC, not through X.
That would make more sense because usually you export X Windows specifically.
Specifically, yeah.
Whereas if you want to get a whole desktop, you have to do like RDP
like this,
or
yeah.
VNC. Or...
But yeah, WSL2. If you have the X server set up on your computer, it will do X window forwarding. So.
Well, every distro should be able to do that. You just use it through SSH or something.
Yeah. So that is WSL2. And that's been Windows. WSL has been out for a little while. WSL2 represents the latest shift, the latest development. They're still working on it. They're still building it. And it's new and improved. And I was kind of waiting on this to come out to do this speech. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about that Microsoft has been doing for to move towards a more Linux-friendly world is the Windows Terminal. So I gave you a sneak peek here as to the Windows Terminal. This is all open source, and this is a well, I guess I should start by describing the difference between a terminal and a shell. So a shell is what you would probably be used to using is the bash shell, or is bash, which is the born again shell, or Powershell, and that is what is running the commands and running it's interpreting everything as it goes along. And then command prompt would have been the old version of the Windows shell. And since 1985, I think Windows 95, yeah, the terminal for Windows has always been console. And console, the console.exe program has remained roughly the same, mostly for compatibility reasons. And so early last year, Windows came up with this initiative called the Windows Terminal.
Thank God.
Right. And so the Windows Terminal, it can run several different shells, and it can run in tabs, and it can run custom graphics. I don't actually know how to type in any of those graphics, but there are custom pieces in here. And the whole thing is, it's going to open up Visual Studio, which I hate. I need to reset the file permissions for this. And the whole thing is built on and configurable via a JSON configuration file, which is also not a normal Windows way to do things, not a normal Microsoft way to do things, to have a config file.
I am impressed. They're actually, doing things well.
Right? It's kind of cool. So in here, I can customize my settings. I can save my JSON file, and I can copy it from my home computer to my work computer, or give it to my buddy. I've shared my profile, my settings.json file with a couple of my coworkers at work, and I can set up custom pictures for the shells that I use. I can have different shells, so I can have different versions of PowerShell. I can have my different versions of WSL loaded in here. I made at work I made a Python shell that just runs Python. So I just have the Python console loaded up, and when I pick that option off of my drop down menu, I just click it, and it opens up a Python interpreter. Yes, there's comments. This is like the default, or the example file. The default has much better commenting. Let me flip over. We go to, I probably actually have this up here. Dynamic profiles, maybe? They have the default one has a GitHub repository that you can download their default profiles. So lots of different options inside of that JSON file, but here's all the documentation on all the different things that you can do with it. And let me just search for the Windows Terminal default config config, something like that. Maybe this one. I know it's on their GitHub repository, but
from IRC, like, yeah, it's really nice that Microsoft is doing things to make the user experience better, as opposed to just forcing it down your throat like OS X does, because they've been really pushing, like, following Apple for some reason, and it's just like, no, let the, like, make neat stuff, make interesting things, but then let the people choose what they want to do.
I do not like the one-size-fits-all mentality, for sure.
Well, the thing that bothers me, I mean, Apple makes some neat stuff and everything, and that's cool, but the thing that bothers me about them is that, like, whenever I was using OS X for a work machine and stuff, if I want to change the behavior of the box, they actively stop me from doing it. They'll, like, oh, well, we updated and removed this thing that people were using it to get around our, like, method of doing stuff. And it's like, why?
Why? Yeah. So, so here's
Microsoft was marching in that direction, and they've
for a
stopped,
long time.
which
For
is
a long
good.
time, yeah. And there's still a lot of that on Windows itself, but this talk is supposed to be about the other stuff. So
right. And this is the good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, this is
certainly
the good,
there is
the good
bad stuff.
Less of the ugly. So, so yes, you can add all these different tabs. You can add different backgrounds. You can have see-through. You can have a darker theme. You can have one with a lighter theme. You can run command prompt in here. You can, I think maybe
Can you run bash in there?
Yeah. This is my WSL right here.
Okay.
Yep. And then it's actually, this one right here is actually being run with the graphics processor. So it will actually run smoother and faster, and the buffer is much larger than the old school console. So if I go...
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, if I go open my regular PowerShell, if I run a really long command, people were finding that the command was being slowed down by the display on the console, and that the console would fill up, the buffer in the console would fill up before. So it's actually, this is being run with a graphics processor on here. So it can run much faster and much smoother. I was following this project for a long, long time, and watching all the developments and watching, like, the Ignite speeches on it. So this was something that I was really excited about, and I tried to compile it from source before it was released, and it didn't go well because I don't know how to do things like that on Windows.
Yeah, I remember in school we had C compilers and stuff. You had to buy, like, you could just use GCC and Linux, but in Windows there was like, oh, you have to use this special version, or you had to jump through all these hoops.
Yep, and then you had to be on a specific version of Windows. But luckily now it is actually out of preview. It's in full release, and you can get it inside the Windows Store. So get started. So all you have to do is go to the Microsoft Store, click download, and then here's the GitHub page. And it's all open source at this point. So if there's anybody following this project on the Linux side, some of these ideas and some of these concepts could make their way into Linux eventually, because it's free and open source now. So
That's pretty fantastic.
yeah, very very neat. I am still very excited about this project.
What I don't know if you mentioned it. I was looking at the IRC chat. You know what it's coded by? Is it you said it was? Is this the C thing you were trying to code, or was
Yes,
the
it's written in C.
Okay, cool.
I'm pretty sure.
I wonder, is it maybe C sharp, or is it just straight up C?
I think it's C sharp.
Okay, yeah, because Microsoft is really heavy in C sharp. Because I mean, I think that's their language.
One of the other cool things that they did with this terminal release is they built their own font and then open sourced the font. So the default font that you run inside of here is also open source.
Yeah, fonts are irritating.
Yeah, and their open source font is called Cascadia.
Ew.
Cascadia Code. I'm trying to look for what it is built in, but I don't know if this document is going to get that detailed. Tips and tricks, gallery, troubleshooting. I don't know. Yeah, but lots of cool things. So,
you know, if Ballmer was running around yelling developers, and they released something like this, maybe people would have actually like said yeah.
So, I'm learning about it right now.
Nice. Yeah.
The other cool thing. So I wish I would have really pimped out this terminal now that I'm experiencing this. But one of the coolest things that I've seen with this is that the guy that was doing one of the presentation videos somehow had his blood sugar monitor connected up, and the computer had his blood sugar readings, and his little prompt right here was an arrow if his blood sugar was going up and down. And I don't know how he did it, but it was like the coolest thing ever. So it was actually like you can
Cool.
you can modify this and customize this and do all kinds of crazy things with these different with terminal really. So
well, and Bash, it's the PS1 variable.
Yep. So yes, that you can update that, you can modify that. What was the other? There's also, so I have all the I have all the what do you call it? The backgrounds loaded in here so that I can just select which one each shell uses. Close window, toggle full screen, allow on top, action settings. Where is the split? Switch to tab, new tab, next tab. All this is customizable. Split pane is Alt-Shift-. So Alt-Shift-. And so now I have a split pane just like you would see in Screen or Tmux. So now I have PowerShell on the bottom and Bash on the top. Alt-Shift+ maybe? Yeah. So now I've got a 4-way window here, and this is inside the terminal, so it's not, but I have PowerShell over here and Windows Subsystem for Linux running Bash over here. So
very cool.
Very, very cool. I find the Windows terminal very, very handy, so I have really appreciated this, and it's all open source and free, which is not something that Microsoft did 10 years ago.
That is fantastic. Like that's been one of my biggest gripes about Windows is like they don't have a good terminal. Now I've tried like Commander, I've tried, and the other ones are okay. Like there's just like little third party ones that are all right, but there's nothing. Just nothing. Like just like XFCE terminal. Like I just can't.
And all those terminals always come with the operating system.
Right. Well, they come with the window manager.
Yeah, with the window manager. XFCE terminal is just fine. What the GNOME terminal is just fine. I mean, whatever comes
Yeah.
with it has just
And you,
run very well for me.
yeah, and you can mix and match it. But the thing is,
Hmm.
people take a lot of care, and because that, they're doing a lot in that system.
Hmm.
They're they're
Using it
using the
every day,
terminal
all
a
the
lot,
time.
and so like for somebody like me that does a lot of Linux administration or coding or different stuff like that, I use the terminal all the time.
Yeah.
And so having a good terminal really makes or break my experience, and it's not something that is all that difficult to make either. So it just always confused me. Like, I mean,
Yep.
it's something that takes a lot of effort and time to make, but then it's done.
Hmm.
Like, it's not, you know.
One of the other things that is cool about Terminal before I move on is that you can run Nano. You can run nano.exe inside of Windows Terminal and run it well. And you can run Midnight Commander inside of Terminal. So there's actually Windows binaries for Nano and I also Vi, I think, and Midnight Commander, and you can run them. And they didn't run well in the console. They would like break things, and things wouldn't be lined up, and it wouldn't resize the window. But it does run well in the terminal, the
Well, I've
Windows
been
terminal.
running with Commander whenever I have to use a Windows box, and I don't have like a Linux VM on it or something.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Vim comes with it, or if maybe I'm using a Windows Vim. Let me look.
Yeah. So I downloaded and installed Nano. You can do it either through Chocolatey, which is a third-party kind of repository for PowerShell. But I downloaded it from the Nano website, and I actually downloaded a binary. And then what I did is I set an alias for Nano to the executable file.
So,
So
oh, it doesn't have no, it doesn't have Vim. Um, I also might not be running the newer version of Windows or something. I don't
yeah.
know. But Chocolatey is actually a really interesting thing that it's a package management system for Windows.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
so they finally got on board with that type of thing too. So like if you're developing stuff for the longest time, like you'd have to be like, all right, distribute this MSI and how do we
Hmm.
get it out there and blah blah blah. Like how do we build the updating
Hmm.
stuff, all this kind of crap. And whereas with Linux, you just do like RPM or Deb
Hmm.
or whatever, and it's way easier. Like Linux got that nailed down in the
Oh yeah.
90s, and like Microsoft just been dying on it for that long.
Hmm.
And Chocolatey is that.
Yep, Chocolatey is almost like a package manager from Linux. But one of the things that Microsoft has actually done that's a little bit closer to that methodology is the PS gallery. So if you're in PowerShell, if you're using PowerShell, and you want to install a PowerShell module, you can do find module, and you will get a list of modules from the PS gallery, which is almost like an apt repository. So now they
Really?
have yes. So now they have modules for. I'm going to stop that because there's a lot in there. It'll go for 30 minutes before it'll stop. But this is PS Gallery, which is official from Microsoft, and these are all things that you can install: Dell BIOS Provider, Azure RM Key Vault,
Oh, that's
uh,
cool.
PowerShell YAML, Azure RM Compute. There's a lot of
Hey,
Azure stuff. There's a lot of Active Directory stuff. There's a
it just
lot of MS SQL.
look at that. Look at that. It only took what 25 years,
Yep,
but Windows has turned it into Linux.
yep. They're doing. I started working at Availity, and when I started working at Availity, I didn't have any Windows computers left. The computer that I was on was my only Windows computer that I had floating around the house, and I had that mostly for like Word, and I wasn't looking at any of this stuff. And then I started work, and I had to work on the Windows computer, and I said, "Where's all my stuff?" And I had to
Hmm.
find this, and I know I've been watching this Microsoft change into Linux thing for a couple years now. And so,
That's exciting. Yeah.
right? So this PS gallery, and you can go
Because
to
it was almost sad.
right. So you can go to PS Gallery has a website that you can go look at if you want to, and just look through their list of things that they've got available. Well, find a module, and then you can search through the module over command line and find lots of different packages and modules and things. Windows Update, SQL Server, all sorts of different packages. So this is their top downloads, right? That you can just install right into PowerShell to update the functionality of PowerShell. So lots of Azure things, some third-party things, just like an apt repository. Azure AD we were using at work. IIS administration, that's their web server. SharePoint, lots and lots of things can be all built right here in or downloaded and installed right through the PS Gallery. So why do a bunch of people in a Linux users group care about PowerShell? Well, now PowerShell is also open source. So PowerShell Core came out about 2 years ago, and PowerShell Core can now be run the same PowerShell on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. And so you can download and install a apt repository that has all the updates required to run PowerShell. And in fact, PowerShell has its own GitHub repository, and you can go read the source code of PowerShell now. So do they have their apt repository on, or their so sudo dpackage? They've got the dpackage. They've got compiled binaries for it. I just added the apt repository and then apt installed. So right here, this is 1604, but you get the idea, right? You would just replace this with 2004. Is you download the GPG key, install the GPG key, sudo apt update, sudo apt install PowerShell, and then you can start PowerShell with pwsh. In fact, I don't think that I have it in WSL, so we can do that. So here I am. I need to copy and pasta some things.
Looks like it's not available in Gentoo, or at least not in the proper repositories.
Well, but you can download the source code and compile
Right,
from
yeah,
source.
yeah. There was just nobody that decided to make a
Emerge.
emerge file for it, yeah.
No. Did not get there.
Well, I mean, it's a source distribution, so like it makes sense that they wouldn't distribute it. They would just distribute the source, and then somebody would come pick it up.
So technically, 2004 isn't supported yet. Interim release, community reported. So apparently they don't have it on the newest version. I've got it installed on my Linux desktop. And I guess I think I just did this right here.
No, there's actually people asking about it.
Yeah.
From 2016. So I get what you said they open sourced it about 2 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I mean, Gentoo users are probably one of the cool things about Gentoo is it comes with all of the build materials because that's how you do your installs and stuff. And so if there's something you can't find, yeah, you probably have all the tools to build it already installed. So just go pull the source and build it.
Where did I stick that?
I'm surprised there's not one in there.
Where did I download this to? It's not in that folder.
So maybe like C users, downloads, whatever.
Here's one that I found the other day that I really liked. 18. Bang 18. Reruns it. There. Unpacking, setting it up. Sudo.
Wait, does Windows come with wget now?
No, I'm
Oh wait, no,
in my
you're
WSL.
in. That's Linux. Okay, sorry.
Yep. So no and yes. So
I have experienced the PowerShell version of that,
yes, yeah. So
and
it's
it is
not.
painful.
It's an alias. It's an alias. Wget and curl is an alias for invoke web command, which is not the same thing. So don't be fooled.
Oh, they actually made aliases. All right, well that's nice at least.
Yeah. So
Because
git
I had
gets.
to help one of my colleagues out with some older Windows
Mm-hmm.
stuff, and he
T.
had an older version of PowerShell, and it was like 20 steps.
Yeah.
And
And
it's like you gotta be freaking kidding
it's
me.
so long to type this crap out. So T RN. Let's see. PS. So they've aliased a lot of the PowerShell commands. LS. So a lot of the PowerShell commands are alias to the Linux version of them. And so wget and curl are both aliases for invoke web request,
Yeah.
which is
I mean, the newer version of it is a lot easier. It's only like 3 commands.
yeah.
But like the old version, like holy mackerel.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So they've
Oh,
aliased enough of the things that you can
the
usually
hurricane's here.
transfer. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So just so if anybody loses us, or if you lose the stream, I'll just type it out on the stream or something that he lost
It's
power.
gone.
So
Also,
yeah.
I'll try to keep recording, and you can watch the rest of it. I'll keep talking to myself and recording, and I'll get the rest of it out, and you can watch it on YouTube later when I get power again.
There you go.
So we've got the update, and did it pull in that extra archive? No, it did not. So anyways, when I installed it on my desktop, all I did was added the Microsoft apt repository and then hit install. Apt add repository universe. So this looks like an important portion of it. But yeah, it's all free and open source now. Sudo apt add repository universe. Sudo apt install PowerShell. Which feels really weird. Yeah, it's got missing dependencies because this is 2004. But to fix that, I could theoretically go over to my 1804. But PowerShell now runs in Linux. It's got its own repository, and it's receiving updates, and it's called PowerShell Core. And so you can run the PowerShell Core with the pwsh command from Bash. And so I've used that for a couple minor things, but the really cool thing about it is that when you're using the PowerShell, even if it's from a Linux computer, you get access to things like PS sessions, importing commands from Exchange, and PS session is like the PowerShell version of SSH, and importing commands from like Exchange servers. So Exchange, in order to run servers on the Exchange server, you have to import the commands from there, and you get access to things like the Active Directory module to be able to interact with Active Directory. So there are a couple things that Bash won't do, can't do, shouldn't do, that PowerShell can do, and now you can access all that stuff from Linux. And it's all also open source.
So Nathan on the YouTube chat was asking if anybody prefers PowerShell over Bash for day-to-day work.
Mm.
I personally don't. Ooh, that was a big lightning strike. I like Bash a lot, but I'm also very, very heavily versed in it. I have known a couple of people that like PowerShell, but those people are generally have been Windows developers, and so they're not very well versed in Bash. So I think it's kind of like what you get used to first. It's kind of the whole like Vim versus Nano flame war type of thing. I like Vim a lot because that's what I learned. I'm really good at it. I can use Nano. Nano can do a lot of the same things Vim can. I know people that very heavily prefer Nano. and I have no friends that prefer Emacs
Emacs.
that I know of. But I think it really comes down to like what you become familiar with. So to me, like PowerShell being pushed over to Linux isn't for the Linux community. It's for the people, well, per se, it's for the people that are very familiar with Windows stuff and they want to go out and do Linux stuff. Then they have the ability to do that. So it's very, very nice. Like I go
Mm-hmm.
to a Windows box and I love seeing Bash and a good
Yeah.
terminal and all that kind of stuff because that makes me be able to jump into a Windows box and be able to do things because really the operating systems are very similar, like
Mm-hmm.
Windows, OS X, and Linux. They're all very basically the same. They have a kernel, they have file systems, they have processes. They're very similar in their basic structures. And so once you become an expert at one, you can generally kind of surf around the other one and kind of know what you're looking for and get things done. And so the tools that you use day to day, if they're able to transit that, which is really nice for like open source tools because then you could just recompile them on something else a lot of times. Then it makes it a lot easier to use on the other operating system from a personal usage standpoint. So your
Yep.
familiarity with the tools.
So I'm not gonna lie. I found something that I could write faster in PowerShell, a quick and dirty type thing than I could in Bash. And so the other day I had to load up PowerShell inside of my Linux computer, and I ran that one little 3-line script because I knew right off the top of my head how to write it in PowerShell, but it would have taken me 15 minutes to write it in Bash. And what it was is it was a simple little program that removed the extra line returns in a copied piece of text. And so for
Okay.
whatever reason, I couldn't get xclip to pull off of my clipboard and put back onto my clipboard properly in the bash shell. And so on my Ubuntu desktop, I wrote a little PowerShell command, and I can use inside of PowerShell, I can use, I gotta copy something so I don't show off whatever I had on my clipboard before, but I can use git clipboard, and that will pull whatever it is. And so then I can set that as a variable. So I can say var equals get clipboard, and then var is equal to whatever I copied, and then I can go foo pipe to set clipboard. And now when I paste off of my clipboard, I have foo on my clipboard. So I just knew how to do this off the top of my head in PowerShell, and it would have taken me 5 minutes to figure out how to run xclip, which was a package I had to download in order to do it. So I just did it in PowerShell.
Well, I've never heard of xclip, but I mean, yeah, that's one of the things. Nathan suggested awk nf, which is a number field.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that would drop potential. Well, I mean, you could edit it and stuff like that. I could do it through awk. Nathan would probably do it through awk or like using cut or
Yep.
set or all
Said,
kinds of
yep.
different things. But I'm familiar with those tools. If
Yep.
you're already familiar with these, then you would prefer to do it in
Yep.
that manner. That's what we were saying earlier.
Yep.
But what I've also seen is one of my other friends that's a Windows guy. He was showing me some neat stuff that he can do with PowerShell, where he can insert key presses or commands or different things
Mm-hmm.
into a program. So he just says, "Hey, that program," and he just names the program or
Mm-hmm.
something. I want to do this, sleep, do that, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so he can actually manipulate a GUI tool with a PowerShell script. And for a Windows administrator, that's very powerful because you can sit there and administrate something that may not have the terminal layer that we're all used to on the Linux. You know?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if it is something that Bash probably has already done for 20 years, but another example of that might be the new PowerShell core has a parallel flag in its for each loop. And so when you set the parallel flag for the for each loop, it will multi-thread, and it will run the for each on everything in the array all at the same time.
In Bash, that would be backgrounding the tasks. So you
Backgrounding the
would put an
task.
ampersand behind it, and then what you can do is you can actually build a wait statement, and you can tell it like wait for, and it'll wait for the four. Like you can build a loop and it'll run it 4 times, run them in the background, and then it'll wait for one of those to expire before it runs the next one. So there's all this logic stuff you can do with that, but that's what would probably be fairly similar to that type of concept.
Oh, I figured out how I can show PowerShell on Linux. SSH desktop.
I'm not sure. One of the Nathan was saying that he wonders if the GUI automation, like being able to reach into the GUI with terminal, like a script or something, if that's available for Linux too. I don't know. Would you know that? Like, can you? I don't know. I don't think you can do that with Bash per se, but with PowerShell, if you're running PowerShell on Linux, could you do that? I don't know. I don't know if that's like a Windows layer or something.
So now I am.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry.
Oh, I was asking you.
Yes. Sorry. No. I realized I could now show off PowerShell on Linux. This is I SSH into my Linux desktop at home, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
Because I'm sitting right next to it. So now I can SSH into my Linux desktop, and I'm now running PowerShell on my Linux desktop from home. So now we can actually look at it. So what was the question again?
The question was basically the thing that my friend had showed me, where you can have PowerShell manipulate a GUI program. Can you do that in Linux? Like if you're running Linux PowerShell? And I don't know.
Oh, why did I run sudo? That's weird. That's interesting that it let me run sudo inside of PowerShell.
Sudo's just a command. Like PowerShell is a shell. Sudo is not part of Bash.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't used it. Honestly, that dinky little script, actually, it's right here. No, not that. It's right here. Trim return. This little thing that I came up with is pretty much the most that I've done with PowerShell for Linux. You know, that little function that I threw in there and ran that to pull the things, and then some
That's just coming up for
minor
me now.
things. Yeah, some little minor things like that I've done actually through PowerShell for Linux. I mostly install it as a novelty, but it serves to illustrate the point of what Microsoft is doing for the Linux community, I think, because it's there and available in open source.
I mean, it's for the Linux community, but I think it's more for the Windows community that needs to reach into Linux.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's making Linux more available. Well, making Linux and Windows, because they're doing it both ways. They're installing Bash, they're installing SSH.
Yeah.
They're making their tools more available to other operating systems, and they're making other operating systems tools more available in Windows.
Yep.
And that allows for the people that have to administrate. Because I don't know about you, but pretty much every environment that I've been in has a mixture of Windows and Linux boxes.
Yeah.
Really small companies, a lot of times, will just have like Windows or something. But any sizable
organization
company is going to have Windows and Linux, because there's things that Windows just does not do well, and there's things that Linux does not do well.
Yep.
And so if you want to have something that is like the best of both worlds, which is what companies are kind of all about most of the time, you're going to have that. And for somebody that's administrating it, let's say it's a Windows heavy environment, right? Well, having the ability to do PowerShell in Linux is a godsend for these people, right? Whereas if it's a Linux heavy environment, you have to deal with these Windows boxes, having Bash and LS and stuff is
Be able to
great
run
because
on Windows.
I'll tell you what, it's infuriating when I type LS and it's just like, what are you talking about?
Uh-huh. Oh, you've got to type dir. I
Right.
was on something it was the I had a shell the other day that I couldn't use any of the aliases, and I had to remember, oh yeah, it's dir and CD, and
Right.
it's
Irritating.
just infuriating. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much the Linux the PowerShell core can reach into the Linux and change programs and things like that. But yeah, I think that you hit it on the head that for sure it's the compatibility and being able to go from one to the other and back. And I think it's really cool that Windows has released it open source and made it available on all operating systems instead of
Yeah.
just like a head nod. And the plan is, or what they were saying at Ignite last year, is that they're not going to have a Linux version of PowerShell and a Mac version of PowerShell and a Windows version of PowerShell. They're going to have PowerShell Core, which is supposed to be the same across all operating systems. So that's kind of cool that they're bringing
That's really the
the
goal as well.
same PowerShell across, so you don't get a watered down version of PowerShell, you get the same one that you would get if you were on Windows.
Yeah. And
So,
and that reaches into other things like Bash, right? So
mm-hmm.
I have I write scripts and things to help people out, and I'll be writing them in Linux, right? Well, I'll be using like Bash 4, and they'll run it in OS X, right?
Mm-hmm.
And OS X, up to the newest version, where I think they're actually transitioning to ZSH for some reason, they're using a really old version of Bash. They're using like 3 something,
Yep.
and it is ancient, and it has like weird stuff that you have to do. And so it's just like I have the same problems with Bash with that incompatibility that PowerShell people have with you're
PowerShell
running
2, PowerShell 3. Yep.
Windows Server 2007, so it's
Yep.
got PowerShell, but it's PowerShell 2.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. PowerShell 2 stuck around for a long, long time.
right? And so they get the same irritations, but I think as it's becoming more and more mature, which is looking like it is, you're getting a lot of the really nice features. You're getting it to where it's going across the board. It's similar across the board. So I think it looks like it's maturing a lot. It looks like Microsoft's maturing a lot in how they're dealing with stuff. And so it's not necessarily that Microsoft loves Linux. It's that Microsoft wants to be part of the party
Mm-hmm.
and not like piss off all the developers. And like if they're nice and people enjoy their product, then people will use their product.
For sure. So moving along to the next item on the list that I had here is PowerShell on Windows, PowerShell on Linux, is Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code is another piece of software that Microsoft produces and has created open source and has released to the community as full open source. And they built it on Windows, Linux, and on Mac once again. And Visual Studio Code, I don't know if I have code on here. I know I have Visual Studio, but I do have
Uh,
Visual Studio Code. It's
I
probably
have
super out
also
of
used
date, so
Visual
don't judge me.
Studio Code, and it is really good.
It's so good. It's just so good.
I usually still use Vim because
Mm-hmm.
crazy, but uh, Visual Studio Code is really good.
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
impressive.
It's no joke. For doing so, what people used to use was a lot of what's that thing called? PowerShell ISE, which I used
I was
for
gonna
writing
say
PowerShell scripts for a long time.
Eclipse, but
Yes, Eclipse. Eclipse is it's on par with some of the features of Eclipse or NetBeans.
yeah,
Yep. And
it's about as good. Like, because I have to use some NetBeans stuff, like the Ruby things, and it doesn't do everything. Like, it doesn't
yeah,
know all the codes, right?
yeah.
So you're gonna still have to cow out to something if you want to do I think it could do some Ruby stuff, but it's not quite as good in other respects. But it's a solid little product. It's got
Mm-hmm.
a module interface that you can actually like plug in modules and do whatnot.
You got
Let's
GitHub.
see. It says YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming.
Okay.
It's still. Oh, it looks like it froze. No.
Give it a couple seconds. Hopefully it'll kick back in.
Yeah.
I have 0 drop frames according to OBS.
Okay. Well, I mean, if nothing else, we'll have the recorded version as well. Do you guys still see it?
I just put it in chat. We can keep talking until somebody tells us that it's down.
That's very true. Yeah.
So yeah, that way we don't have an interruption in the recording either. So it's also got GitHub support in here. It'll do your difference between your GitHub pushes. It'll push to repositories. It's got debugging tools. And then, yeah, you're right, it's got the extensions. So the extension, this is the command palette, this is the extension list. And the extension
the extensions
list,
are really powerful.
yeah, it's got Python, it's got PowerShell, it's got just tons and tons of different extensions that are also community driven. So people can write different extensions for their different languages, and it will have all the different kind of what do you call it? The color. What do you call it? Context coloring and the some of the suggested modifications. So if you're writing in PowerShell and you have the PowerShell suggestions module loaded in here, it will make recommendations to you, like you should use this version of the command instead of that one, or you know, hey, you missed a comma here, that kind of stuff. So it's really powerful, it's really good, and I really enjoy using Visual Studio Code for a lot of different things. And it's also available on Linux desktops or Linux computers. So it will install.
There is with the code. It's there is an open source version of Microsoft Code, and then there's like the primary one that they distribute. If you want a full OSS version for Windows, I believe you can pull that down. But the ones that are for Linux and Mac are probably just the open source ones. So they are a touch different.
You're talking about Visual Studio versus Visual Studio Code?
No, Visual Studio Code specifically.
Okay.
There is an open source version and a almost open source version.
Okay.
At least that's what I had seen before. So maybe they merged them or did something weird or whatever. But at one point it was just like, you know, here's the open source version and here's the mostly open source version.
Yeah, they've got hooks into, I forgot about that, they've got hooks into WSL in Visual Studio.
Oh, that's neat.
So you can actually write Bash in Visual Studio Code, and it will allow you to test into WSL2. SSH, you can actually connect into a remote box and have your code that you're writing run on a remote box and in containers. Lots of neat things that it will do. Java. So again, and just like what you're saying, is getting all the developers on board and getting in nice with the developers. So for sure that they will. They're doing neat things in that realm, and it's available on Windows, Linux, and Mac.
Yeah, and that's well appreciated by folks.
Lots of people. So, VS Codium versus VS Code without telemetry. Cool. So I guess maybe VS Codium is the full open source. Maybe I need to
I'm not sure.
Read more. I thought Visual Studio Code was full open source now. Common questions, issues reported on GitHub. What's the difference between Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code? Visual Studio Code runs on Mac OS X Linux. See requirements documentation. Is VS Code free? Yes, it's free for private or commercial use. See the product license for details. So we can take a look at the VS Code product license, which is Microsoft software license, Microsoft Visual Studio Code. So it looks like they have some kind of proprietary license on it.
Yeah, it's free, but not open source.
It's free, but not open
Per
source.
se. I think there are parts of it that are open source.
Okay.
And there's potentially an open source version, because I don't think you can distribute it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, you can distribute it for Linux without it being open source, because Linux is just a combination of things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Linux specifically, like the kernel, is GPL. But okay, so Nikos on the IRC is saying that VS Code is open source, but they compile telemetry in it and brandings. Okay, so the telemetry and the brandings are the non-open source bits.
Which I'm still okay with.
It's kind of like Firefox. I remember for a while, and they might still do it. Debian had Iceweasel, and Iceweasel is Firefox without the branding, because the branding was not open source.
Yeah, it was.
But the rest of the code was.
Yeah. So here I found Visual Studio Code, VS Code on GitHub, and it's got an MIT license. So that's pretty good, at least. So and then
MIT license allows them to sell it and
some other
restrict
things.
it and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a decent license.
Yeah. So, but here it is on GitHub. You can read the source code, or at least most of the source code here on GitHub. So again, another shift in Microsoft thinking that was not the way that it would have been 5-10 years ago. So a cool little thing that they've done with Visual Studio Code, and I'd highly recommend you all check it out.
Yeah.
One of the last things that I wanted to pull up is this GitHub page, or not GitHub, Wikipedia page that I found when I was getting ready for this speech. And it's a whole Microsoft and open source. And it talks about some of the cool things that it talks about here that I was kind of learning about. Is that that they had bought GitHub, which I remember, but and I remember worrying about it, but it ended up being not a bad deal. I haven't seen any plus or minus out of GitHub since Microsoft purchased them. And then I read a little bit on this article about the CEO started kind of shifting the company towards open source and cloud in 2014. And that they now are one of the largest supporters of the Open Source Foundation financially. There
have been some murmurs about them, like people think that they're trying to take over that stuff.
Yeah, I remember somebody saying that at one of our meetings when I brought up Microsoft.
I mean, who knows? That could be true, but probably not.
Yep. Investments in Linux technology, server technology organizations, including the Linux Foundation, the Open Source Initiative, and the Linux-based operating systems powers the company's Azure cloud services, which I'll talk about next. So they're putting money into the Linux kernel and the open source community and the Linux Foundation. So, and then I read an article earlier when Dan was sharing something about Azure being backed by Linux shortly, that Linus Torvald is all about, it's like accepting Microsoft's help in the Linux Foundation. So it says Linux server technology and Linux development to promote cross-platform compatibility and collaboration with open source companies and communities, culminating with Microsoft's platinum sponsorship of the Linux Foundation and a seat on its board of directors. So that's pretty cool that Microsoft, a company that 10 years ago would have was trying to crush Linux and wouldn't have done anything to support Linux at all, is now a platinum sponsor in the Linux Foundation.
Oh, on that, I thought the same thing. Like you've seen other companies like Oracle and other things that have that same kind of crush mentality, where it's just like they'll snatch something and just destroy it. And if you look into them, I bring up Oracle because specifically I looked into them. They actually put a lot into the open source community. They actually put
yeah.
a lot into the open source community. They lots of code,
Yeah.
lots of like money on doing stuff, and it's pretty impressive. So like, take a second look at a lot of these things. But I've also heard some people argue that open source has become not open source per se anymore. It's gone from people kind of hacking and building neat stuff
Mm-hmm.
and stuff that they want into coding for free or like building projects for companies.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is definitely
Yeah.
a
That's
thought
unfortunate.
to be had about that behavior, and that might be why companies are more apt to push things into open source, because it's more corporate driven now than it used to be, whereas before it would be like, I made a neat thing and then
Mm-hmm.
moved on, and then like it broke or something, and then
Yeah.
I came back and fixed it eventually, as opposed to like some, and it's, you can see that in all of today's products and things. Like you go to Reddit and you expect that it works, and even though you never put money at it or anything,
Yeah.
like,
It's gonna work, right?
yeah.
Which is kind of reminds me a lot of the Cuckoo. Cuckoo Sandbox is all open source and it's owned by the Cuckoo Foundation. And but it's a lot of work on your part to get it all set up and run and configured. It's not an out of the box commercial solution like some of the other things that are out there. So, as an example of just open source for companies versus open source of people, making cool things at home.
Yep.
So then the last thing that Dan had mentioned to me that I think is really cool is that Linux is supporting patch kernels in order to build a complete virtualization stack that will eventually be able to support Azure with Hyper-V. So basically will allow Linux to support Hyper-V, which is Windows's, let me just blow this up a little bit because the text is tiny and the ads are huge, which will allow Linux to support Hyper-V, it looks like. Very early pre-alpha stage, but Linux is supposed to be at the root partition of the cloud hypervisor for Azure.
Yeah. So they basically describe Hyper-V as being somewhat like Zen, where you have a DOM 0 or a DOM U, and that controls all the resources and then builds the VMs and such. And so right now you have to do everything with Windows,
Yeah.
but they're doing RFCs for kernel patches, Linux kernel patches, to let Linux be the DOM U for that backend structure, which is, it's impressive. Like that, they're basically porting the ability for their virtualization stack to run in an operating system that they don't own.
Yeah. So would that be at the same level of ES as ESXi, KVM,
Uh,
ESXi, and Zen?
so the way that the stack works, like a short thing, is basically you have hardware, then you have an operating system, and then there's abstraction layers, and you have different technologies like VTD
Yeah.
that allow the hardware to be more directly accessed by the VMs.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically there has to be a management layer there,
Yep.
and that's what the DOM 0 is. It's allocating and managing the resources of the machine, the memory, the CPU, the storage, all that kind of stuff, and it's acting like a manager where it's sitting there shifting the resources and puppeteer almost. It's telling everybody where all their stuff is, and so you have to have the hypervisor is that thing,
Mm-hmm.
and that technology is what that is. And so generally they run on an operating system or inside of an operating system. So KVM is it's the kernel virtualization
Mm-hmm.
stuff. It's built into the Linux kernel, but then it also has tools and stuff outside. like Versh and like QEMU and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with well, with really any of them. So there's a host operating system that's running on the hardware, and then it's got all these other hooks and interfacing layers, and that's the hypervisor bit. Yeah,
Yep. So if you can see the diagram that I found quickly here, the Zen would be
yeah,
the
yeah.
hypervisor. Now,
Zen is the hypervisor. It's the um, operating system. So one thing that I'm curious about is if they're talking about DOM 0 or the Zen layer there, because Zen I think is the DOM U, or no, that's not, those are the little guys. I'm not sure. So it'd be interesting to kind of drill down into that because I didn't go very in depth on that.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because I think they were talking about DOM 0, which means that it potentially still needs to run on Windows.
Potentially, but instead of Zen, I think they're trying to get Hyper-V. By my reading, they want Hyper-V being able to run as its own standalone without having other things. Just like Zen's DOM 0, said Microsoft Principal. Hyper-V's structure is more similar to KVM or to Zen than it is to KVM or ESXi, so these are different. Knowledge that it drew inspiration from the Zen code in Linux.
Yeah, so this is Zen's structure, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Zen is probably being represented there as a thin Linux machine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a while since I played with Zen, but yeah. You have DOM 0, you have DOM U. The DOM U's are the little VMs. The DOM 0 is the management VM that interfaces. So
Yeah. So
it would be
all.
cool if you can just like fire up a Linux box and run Hyper-V
Mm-hmm.
or KVM or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, just whatever you felt like
Yep.
doing. So that's pretty neat if that's the case.
Install Hyper-V bare metal and then be able to run more
Well, it'd be
things
in
on
a
top of
Linux
that.
box. Yeah.
Well, it would be built on a Linux kernel, but it would be its own operating system, right?
No. Okay. So Hyper-V is the virtualization technology.
Yes.
It's a set of kernel modules and
Mm-hmm.
different things. It's not its own operating system.
Yeah. I thought the
Um,
shift was to make it its own operating system built on Linux instead of Windows.
as far as I know, no,
No.
but it would still be Linux
Yeah.
or Windows.
Yeah.
Like you'd
That's the
still
important
have
part. Yeah.
Linux or Windows. It would just be a very like if that like ESXi. ESXi is Linux. It's Red
Mm-hmm.
Hat Linux
Mm-hmm.
specifically,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like 32 megs
Yeah. Yeah. It's
because
tiny and it's
it's
single
almost not
purpose.
Linux. It's literally like here's a very, 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 very heavily stripped down kernel and operating system with like
Mm-hmm.
BusyBox and stuff,
Yep.
and then the hypervisor, and that's it,
Yeah.
and like a web interface, and that's it. That's the whole
That's all it
operating
does.
system
Yep.
because they don't want that base operating system taking up those valuable resources that you're going to be trying to give to VMs.
Yeah. For sure.
So it's still Linux. It's just
Single
stripped
purpose
down.
Linux. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that has been my presentation on some of the changes that Microsoft has made over the last, really, I guess it's been almost 6 years, that they've been shifting towards a more open source, more Linux friendly environment, and whether it primarily benefits themselves or benefits a little bit of everyone or benefits Linux users specifically. I think that it's a good thing that Microsoft has started to keep in mind some of the Linux users out there and has started to develop products and to bridge the gap between Windows type machines and Linux type machines. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you again next month at the Jacksonville Linux Users Group.
Not in person.
Not yet, at
But
least.
yeah, not yet, not yet. But thank you very much, Michael, for presenting. It was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
You get a little clap. Uh, and yeah, if anybody else wants to do a presentation, please let us know. We'd love to have guest presenters. I've been presenting a lot this year, and I very much appreciate Mike and Will taking up a couple of months. And so this was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
And I'll
everybody.
see y'all next month.
All right. Bye.
Bye.